Our next speakers are Rick Doblin and Natalie Ginsberg, joining us from MAPS. MAPS is a unique organization that not only focuses on research, but also tries to focus on cultural implementation, something that we're talking about or thinking about with the 10 years hence perspective. Rick and MAPS have been instrumental in setting forth an okayness to using psychedelics for personal development, not just in a medical context. So I'm going to read you bios, but not topic, because topic I think they're going to just talk about anyway. So Rick Doblin, PhD, is founder and executive director of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS. He received his doctorate in public policy from Harvard's JFK School of Government, where he wrote his dissertation on the regulation of the medical uses of psychedelics and marijuana, and his master's thesis on a survey of oncologists about smoked marijuana versus the oral THC pill. His undergraduate thesis at New College in Florida was a 25-year follow-up to the classic Good Friday experiment, also known as the Miracle at Marsh Chapel, where Walter Pahnke administered psilocybin to 10 divinity students and a placebo to 10 more. And after, I think, about 45 minutes, everybody in the room knew who had gotten the placebo and who had gotten the psilocybin. So a 25-year follow-up to those 20 people. I think you located 19 of them out of the 20, which is remarkable in itself. And those results stood in 25 years. So he evaluated the potential of psychedelic drugs to catalyze religious experiences, or assess that. He also conducted a 34-year follow-up study to Timothy Leary's Concord prison experiment, and Rick studied with Dr. Stanislav Grof and was among the very first to be certified as a holotropic breathwork practitioner. His professional goal is to help develop legal contexts for the beneficial uses of psychedelics and marijuana, primarily as prescription medicines, but also for personal growth and for otherwise healthy people, and eventually to become legally licensed psychedelic therapist. He founded MAPS in 1986. It's been over 30 years for those guys, and currently resides in Boston with his wife and 3 children. Rick needs no introduction, but I love reading that because it's amazing to hear about a person who's dedicated his life to this world. And in our generational sort of setup, we have, we're going to not use the podium so much, but sit in chairs, and we also have then joining Rick, the very important Natalie Ginsberg, who works as MAPS Policy and Advocacy Manager. And she'll be presenting with Rick. We have to advance the machines, I'm guessing. So Natalie Lila Ginsberg earned her master's in social work from Columbia University in 2014, her bachelor's in history from Yale University in 2011. At Columbia, Natalie served as a policy fellow at the Drug Policy Alliance, where she helped legalize medical marijuana in her home state of New York. Yes, and worked to end New York's racist marijuana arrest. Natalie has also worked as a court-mandated therapist for individuals arrested for prostitution and drug-related offenses, and as a middle school guidance counselor. Why didn't I get you when I was in middle school as my guidance counselor? As a middle school guidance counselor at an New York City public school. Natalie's clinical work with trauma survivors spurred her interest in psychedelic-assisted therapy, which she believes can ease a wide variety of both mental and physical ailments by addressing the root cause of individuals' difficulties rather than their symptoms. Through her work at MAPS, Natalie advocates for research to provide evidence-based alternatives to both the war on drugs and the current mental health paradigm. So, Rick and Natalie, we're set up? Good. Looking forward to hearing you. Thank you.
I'd like to just add one little bit to my bio there. Essentially, I feel I'm a drug-using, countercultural criminal who is trying to go legit. And in the process, I'm trying to bring psychedelics along as well, and I do like the idea of mainstreaming. I can see how it sounds, in some ways boring and takes away the energy from, we've got the latest, greatest thing. But I think it's about mainstreaming our whole selves. It's not about leaving things behind in order to become mainstream. It's about really taking our full selves into the heart of the culture and eventually being accepted and appreciated, hopefully. And I see it happening too.
Well, along the lines of this countercultural criminal. I'd like to start by asking about what it was like in the good old days before MDMA was illegal. And yeah, before it was first scheduled and criminalized, how was MDMA use viewed? And could you maybe walk us through briefly the process leading up to the scheduling of MDMA? Because I know you were involved in protesting that process.
Yeah, it's great that you ask about the good old days, because a lot of times when people of my age start talking about the good old days, people of your age start cringing.
Not when it's about drugs, usually.
Yeah, it was the good old days in some ways, and I learned so much from those early days when MDMA was legal that really inspired me to try to bring that back. So I was completely unaware of the psychedelic underground. I had gotten very interested in LSD in 1971 and 72, and I took a lot of LSD and mescaline and other things, and really couldn't handle it, and went to the guidance counselor and college, and the guidance counselor was very sympathetic, actually, and handed me this book, Realms of the Human Unconscious by Stan Groff, in manuscript copy, and reading that book really changed my life, because here was science looking at states of consciousness, spirituality, and aspects of religion, but focused on healing. And I thought this was absolutely terrific. And what was clear to me, though, was that I had become aware of LSD shortly after the backlash. I didn't really appreciate it when it was happening during the 60s. I believed the propaganda. So, well, go back to Leo, just for a second. Yeah. Okay, so when I learned about MDMA, it was 1982. And it was at Esalen. I was doing a month-long workshop with Stan Groff, and a woman, Debbie Harlow, came by with MDMA, and she started talking about how there was this new drug, and it helped people feel love, and it helped people feel connection, and helped people talk to others. And I thought, how boring. I feel love, I feel fine, and I'm used to psychedelics. You've done enough when you can't talk. so but of course I was just barely smart enough to buy some anyway. And then I went home and did it with my girlfriend, and it was astonishing. It was so profound. And so I felt this tremendous opportunity that I had woken up to LSD after it was criminalized, after the research was shut down. But I woke up to MDMA when it was still legal. But in 1982, I was still a little bit late to the party. I mean, it had been developed around 75, 76. Leo Zeff, who's in that picture, was the leader of the underground psychedelic psychotherapy movement. He worked with Sasha Shulgin and Ann Shulgin, and when they would have new drugs that they thought would be valuable, they would turn it over to Leo. And he came out of retirement to work with MDMA. But it was also being sold at the time as ecstasy already. And it was clear that it was doomed, because whenever these drugs are being used in public settings, this was during the Nancy Reagan escalation of the drug war and Just Say No, it was clear that there was going to be this conflict inevitably. And the way that MDMA was being distributed, it was being distributed under the code name Atom. And it wasn't connected to the chemical nature of it. It was just called Atom. And Leo, through his work, introduced it to hundreds of psychiatrists and psychotherapists, and they used it in their practices, spread it to other people, and it was one of these other people that took it in this context that thought, aha, there's a bigger market here and I could make, fortune, and people need this drug. So once I learned about MDMA, I thought this is an opportunity to get involved to try to protect it for this inevitable crackdown, and having it be legal was absolutely fantastic. I mean, we think we're immune to a lot of propaganda, but it's incredible the number of people that have talked to me about MDMA causing holes in the brain because they've seen the slides from Oprah and from MTV, and all of this neurotoxicity concerns, that just, kind of wear on you in the background in some ways. So there was none of that. This was just this fresh new drug that had people talking about how much it opened them up to love and to connection, and it felt so healing. And there was different people, myself included, that had challenging LSD experiences during the 60s or 70s, and MDMA helped to integrate, even after a decade or more, those challenging experiences. So we were able to communicate to other people about this drug, and they were more willing to listen because it was legal and because there wasn't this kind of propaganda about how dangerous it was. So the best example for me to explain to you now what it meant was, there was a book in 1983 by Robert Mueller, New Genesis, Shaping a Global Spirituality. He was the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. And he wrote this book about how we need mysticism. Basically, the idea was mysticism is the antidote to fundamentalism, and that psychedelics can produce this sense of connection, and that it goes beyond the ego, and then we see we're all the same. And then how do we hate Muslims, or how do we hate people that are different color, or we're all the same? How do we trash nature? And it was about the political implications of this. So I wrote him a letter and said, great book, you didn't say anything about psychedelics, but there's MDMA, it's still legal, and it has the spiritual potential. There's the Good Friday experiment, and every new way of killing gets unlimited money, so how about helping us restart psychedelic research and protect MDMA? So he said, well, first off, he wrote me back, which was astonishing. I was just like a college undergraduate. And he said, I understood his book, I understood what he was trying to say, and he said, here's a bunch of religious professionals that would be interested in hearing from you. Of course, I read between the lines, and I heard him say, send them MDMA. So Rabbi Zalman Schachter, Brother David Steindl-Rast, Vanya Palmer, as experts in Zen meditation, Christian mysticism, Jewish mysticism, and of course, I sent them MDMA because it was legal. They didn't have to worry about it, and then they took some in as aid meditation in different ways. Zalman talked about MDMA being like the Sabbath. It was pretty great, and so we decided though that as this was as we were building this kind of support, we were having meetings at Esalen, and there was to plan the defense, and there was one meeting that was pretty crucial with Terence McKenna, and Terence was talking about how if it's from nature it's good, and if it's from the lab it's bad. And MDMA is from the lab, and we should go with things that have thousands of years of history. And I was like, Terence, that's so ridiculous. We're part of nature, our minds are part of nature. And I said, I'll put up some money, let's do a first secret underground MDMA study to get some safety data for when it would be time for the crackdown. Then we'd have some safety data. And Dick Price, who's the co-founder of Esalen, put up some money. Before you know it, we were able to conduct a secret study, and keeping the data private until the time would come for us to challenge the DEA with it. So that all of these things could be taking place in this legal context. And so it was just this remarkable opportunity. And then in the summer of 1984 is when the DEA decided to criminalize MDMA. They did not hear at all of the word of MDMA. They'd never even heard of Atom. They just heard of ecstasy. And so that's what really motivated them to try to crack down. At the time, there was only 8 emergency room visits. Nobody had died. The problem was there were no problems. Here's a drug that loads of people are doing, and they seem to be benefiting from that. And that's kind of counter to what the drug war was about. So there came time for these hearings, and we were able to get people from all walks of life, Harvard Medical School, Lester Grinspoon, others, to testify for us because they could talk about it when they had these experiences, when it was legal. So it was this golden moment of experimentation and communication throughout the culture that kind of collided with the repressive nature of the drug war. Now, I've got one question for you about how the domestic criminalization, we were slowing the DEA down in the DEA administrative law judge hearings in the U.S. And then I became aware of the fact that they were moving internationally to criminalize MDMA through the WHO, the World Health Organization. And in one of the most remarkable synchronicities, it turned out that the committee, the expert committee at the WHO that was reviewing the data from MDMA and a bunch of other drugs as to whether to recommend that they be criminalized, was Stan Groff's brother. Paul Groff was a prominent psychiatrist in Canada, focused a lot on depression, and he was the chair of the committee that would evaluate MDMA. And I arranged through Robert Mueller for me to go to WHO. He helped me to meet up with the scientific advisors and this expert committee, and we presented some information. And then the committee voted to criminalize MDMA. Everybody but Paul voted to criminalize MDMA, and Paul was able to get this very little asterisk, a footnote, saying that the chairman of the committee voted against criminalization because he thought it would inhibit research, and they put in this little paragraph that said the nations of the world encourage more research into this most interesting substance. And that was like, in a way, an overall defeat, but we got this one little footnote that was used later by the Swiss government to justify opening up MDMA from 88 to 93. So, how do you see, you've just been representing MAPS and representing the psychedelic community with the United Nations General Assembly Special Section on Drug Policy. So what is your sense of what's going on internationally, and do we have any hope for reform at that level?
Well, first of all, I guess a little bit of background about this UN General Assembly special session on the world drug problem is what it's called. It was the first time in 20 years that the UN General Assembly had met to revisit international drug treaties. And 20 years ago, the mission was for a drug-free world. That was the model. So 20 years later, the drugs have just increased in abundance. So it was an interesting time to reassess. And I would say, on one hand, it was definitely a bit disappointing that despite the fact the drug war is so clearly failing, the general movement of the UN and different countries represented there was kind of perpetuating this drug war rhetoric generally, though they did incorporate a bit of progress. But for me, what was really inspiring about these meetings was that it pulled together human rights and drug policy activists from all around the world. And that was a really empowering part of this work, to connect with people doing work in all different countries and learning more closely about what's happening, and how we can all work together to ultimately influence the UN, hopefully, because progress is made by individual countries trying innovative things and reforming, and then that ultimately impacts the UN. The UN is not really the body that's most innovative and kind of leading the way, but kind of following. But I guess, generally the focus at this drug summit, I can't say it was on psychedelics. A big focus was about ending capital punishment for drug crimes, which, with what's going on in the Philippines right now with this, mass murder of drug dealers, we see how urgent and crisis-oriented and reactionary drug policy has to be sometimes. But some research that I was actually surprised to find was that according to the WHO, MDMA is actually the third most used illicit substance in the world after cannabis and amphetamines. So that was a really interesting piece to be speaking about in this context, when many of the drug policy activists were really focused on moving away from a criminalization and drug war approach to a public health and harm reduction oriented approach. So speaking about psychedelic harm reduction in the broader spectrum of harm reduction work, I think was really important, and likewise for us to kind of stand in solidarity with the broader drug policy movement working in all forms of harm reduction. And I guess speaking globally of other countries, they're certainly leading the way in psychedelic harm reduction, unfortunately, beyond the US. I was recently in Barcelona, where the Spanish government actually pays for something called energy control, which is a drug testing space. So I visited this place where people send in their drugs. You can send in your MDMA for a really affordable price. And it's so affordable that people from the US actually send their drugs to Barcelona to get tested. And the government sends back the results. They also had government-created snorting straws and all different harm reduction tools, which was just so shocking to try to imagine the US government funding something like that, let alone allowing that to happen. Because currently, under the so-called RAVE Act, many venues and places are afraid of even allowing harm reduction measures to happen because they don't want to be held liable under this law for letting drug use happen on their premises. But we had some exciting progress with that this year at Burning Man, finally. The Zendo project, which is MAP's psychedelic harm reduction project, was finally kind of officially recognized by Burning Man, and each person attending Burning Man got information about the Zendo in their greeter packet. So that was really a huge progress, but still absolutely no drug testing permitted at Burning Man, and there's a long way to go, and we have a lot to learn from different countries like Portugal that's also decriminalized, and at Boom they've had psychedelic harm reduction really well integrated for a long time.
Yeah, I'll just say that my job, I feel, is to be perpetually dissatisfied, and want more. And once I'm, happy, then that means somebody else should lead MAPS. So after we had the Burning Man organization tell 70,000 people about Zendo, we also had the leader of our Zendo team, Sarah Gale, gave a presentation to the police, the Bureau of Land Management. 60 federal police heard about Zendo and were sympathetic with it. And so I was sitting around thinking, okay, what's next? What do we do next? And so now we're going to be applying to the DEA for a special license to set up a drug testing program at Burning Man.
Yeah. So next year, hopefully.
Oh, okay.
So I also wanted to say...
let me just say one last thing, which is that it was Biden that put in this RAVE Act, reducing America's vulnerability to ecstasy. And it's pathetic, but we had this all-night Burning Man event on the Washington, D.C. Mall, and several days after that, after, protesting the drug war and... There we go. So it actually took place. But several days after that, Natalie, you went to see Biden's staff.
Yes.
So going from right outside the White House, dancing all night, and then protesting the drug war. So what was it like when you went to see Biden's staff?
Unfortunately, they weren't even really familiar with the RAVE Act and the negative repercussions that it was having, which was quite frustrating. And I can't say that they were really that interested in engaging as much as I would have hoped, but I do have more hope that in this Amend the RAVE Act campaign, I work with Stephanie Jones from Drug Policy Alliance and Dee Dee Goldsmith, whose senator is Senator Kaine, who actually has been supportive of this process and sent a letter to the DEA kind of asking in support of amending the RAVE Act. So that was pretty encouraging that we kind of have this connection to the current vice president, hopefully the next vice president. So I'm sorry, we don't have so much time, so we're going to move along. Yes. So can you talk to us briefly about the path towards rescheduling, and what are some of the implications of rescheduling and descheduling? How would that impact medical access, legal access, harm reduction? That briefly.
Okay, I'll do it very briefly, which is descheduling means legalization. Rescheduling means changing it from Schedule 1 to some other schedule so that it's actually a prescription medicine. And so I think that we need to work on parallel tracks. So descheduling is something that we're anticipating will take place around 2035. We're anticipating MDMA becomes a medicine around 2021. If our negotiations with FDA go well. We have a meeting on November 29th coming up with FDA about the phase 2, phase 3 transition. And if it goes well, then we anticipate 2021, also the similar dates probably for psilocybin. And then we have probably 10 years of setting up psychedelic clinics throughout the United States and Europe, and then people get more comfortable with the whole concept of beneficial uses of psychedelics in psychotherapy, and the clinics expand to become places where people can bring their families for sessions, and then beyond that, the country gets comfortable with marijuana legalization, which will maybe be somewhere like 2022 or so. It's kind of a race. Does marijuana get legal federally, or does MDMA or psilocybin become a medicine first? And the path is really the path trod by Big Pharma. I mean, we have to acknowledge that that the scientific method is crucial, that we lie to ourselves all the time and we see what we want to see, and we need the scientific method, and we need to do the research according to the FDA standards. And I think that that's achievable. We have support from within FDA to do the studies, and so the rescheduling, the key point to understand about rescheduling is that what we're talking about is psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. It's really about the psychotherapy. So the drug is never going to be a take-home drug. There's all sorts of ways in which the FDA can regulate how drugs are become medicines. And so I think we're not talking about MDMA becomes a medicine or psilocybin becomes a medicine and anybody can prescribe it. It'll be only people with certain kind of training, and then only in certain kind of clinic settings, and only for administration under direct supervision. And that's the vision that we have for the rescheduling. I should add one last thing, which is it's probably going to be about $25 million. That's our current estimate. We have almost half of that already raised or pledged. So I think it's within reach, and I think there's such a need in society for this kind of healing that, that we will be able to make it happen. Now, my question for you is, you're very focused on, social justice. And so I've just talked really about rescheduling for medicine, and so how does the movement towards legitimizing and obtaining approval for prescription use of psychedelics, how does that relate to social justice?
So MDMA and psychedelic therapy is so effective because it encourages the individual to address, the root source of their trauma and their issue beyond just their symptoms. And often in really trying to examine the root cause, broader kind of social causes of trauma and pain start to come into the picture. I've had the privilege of watching hours of MDMA therapy tapes from MAPS, and I was really struck by how so many veterans who are recounting their trauma from war often recounted the trauma of perpetration and of committing violence, and that was really what was coming up for people. And there was this one woman that really sticks in my head who I remember crying out, I had to kill those children, I had to kill those children, they were coming at us. And then right after saying, how could I have been a part of something where I was forced to kill children? And kind of really starting to question the violence of war and the greater causes and systems that are forcing her to be a part of that.
People have questioned me about whether it's ethical for us to work with veterans and work with the military. Are we helping inadvertently to make it easier to wage war, or is there some dark side of what we're doing? And how do you view that?
I also get asked that, and also asked we do work in Israel also with veterans, and I receive a lot of questions like that. And I think part of this healing process is also about healing your fear. And when you're in these states of violence, you're acting out of fear and protection. So I think healing is a really essential part in stopping cycles of violence and stopping fear. And I think really the only way to move forward and move towards peace is healing on kind of both sides, and not just the so-called victims, but recognizing that often the oppressors and perpetrators are experiencing a lot of trauma themselves that inspire them to act out of fear and perpetuate violence. So I think it's really essential to stop these cycles of violence to heal. And beyond the trauma from war, which is something that we speak about often in the context of veterans, I think what we often don't really recognize is that the great trauma that stems from social injustice in general. And actually there's greater percentages of people suffering from PTSD in marginalized communities, from suffering from oppressions like racism, sexism, homophobia, poverty. They're actually higher rates than in returning war veterans often, and to recognize that, and to recognize there's a researcher named Dr. Monica Williams who's doing some pioneering work on PTSD from racism. She actually attended a MAPS MDMA therapy study and wrote a piece for our bulletin if you're interested in hearing more about that. But I think just to take the example of racial trauma, and to think about what Black Lives Matter in this country means today, the fact that there needs to be a movement asserting that Black Lives Matter is a response to a very traumatic feeling that Black lives don't matter. And I mean, the combination of intergenerational trauma, starting from slavery to Jim Crow to segregation to our current systems of mass incarceration and police violence, compounding that with the current state of being a person of color and turning on the news and seeing someone shot by the police for no reason, and just the different levels of trauma that creates really does also manifest in individual PTSD. So in that way, I see a lot of potential in psychedelic healing and addressing these greater social injustices and helping us recognize the harms from these social injustices.
Yeah. To show how these ideas are getting mainstreamed, again, to use that word, there was an incredible article in the journal Cell, which is one of the most highly rated, highest impact factor journals in the scientific literature. And this was July 14th of 2016, and it was by two neuroscientists from Stanford. And they said, we have to unleash the entire range of techniques of modern neuroscience to study mechanisms of action of MDMA. And the last two sentences were something that Natalie or I could have written ourselves, because it was saying basically the world needs more compassion and empathy, and the study of MDMA is one small step to get us towards that goal. So it was just so totally heartening to see this coming from mainstream neuroscience, and they recognize that this is an avenue to try to help with multi-generational trauma, with all these things. That's why for me we've made a fundamental alliance with the drug policy reform movement, because the kind of healing that we need, and when we talk about the current political climate, it's really not about Trump. But it's about millions and millions of people who are vulnerable to having their fears and anxieties be triggered by things that he is saying. And so we have to have broad-based mental health with millions of people beyond just clinically treating conditions, and that's why I think we have to go beyond legalization. But one of the things that's so concerning to me is that a lot of the people who go to war are actually people of color. And yet, in our studies, we have not had a single African American in our study. We've had over 1,000 people volunteer for 24 spots in our study of veterans, firefighters, and police officers, and we've not been able to really get one African American. And I wonder why you think that might be and what we can do about that.
Well, I think, first of all, it's important to engage with people of color and ask. But I would say from what I could guess, there's a really long history in this country of research and experimentation on Black people in particular, injecting people with syphilis and doing really horrific things. So I think there's a lot of reason for the Black community to have a lot of mistrust over some new, innovative, kind of crazy therapy that works with your brain. I think there's a big need to proactively reach out to communities and educate and talk about our work and not just expect that they'll come. And on top of that, I think I've spoken to many people of color who've had really difficult experiences with therapists who don't quite understand their experiences of trauma. And so I think it's also really important that we work with therapists who are conscious of these issues, that are also people of color or not, but who are really engaged with these issues, to provide a safe space for people of color going through our research when they are, examining all of their trauma. It's really important to provide the safest space possible. And I know we're kind of running out of time, but can I ask one more quick question of Rick?
No, we can't. We are out of time. Thank you so much. Please help me thank Natalie Ginsberg and Rick Doblin from MAPS.
I know the question. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Now, before we move before we move into Q&A, Kevin has something to say to us. Kevin.
So I normally don't do things like this, but because it is the 10th year, I'm going to take some liberties. I wanted to share a harm reduction story with everyone that I personally witnessed. This was probably in 2000 or 2008, 2007 or 8 at Burning Man, when I was also working on the harm reduction team there with MAPS and other collaborators. And there was someone who was severely agitated, on the verge of becoming violent, surrounded by basically a circle of law enforcement officers who were ready to tase and zip tie this person. And there was a woman who was working with the harm reduction unit who very slowly and gently approached this person, step by step, conversational voice, infinite patience, very slow, very kind, very non-confrontational. And it must have taken 6 or 7 or 8 minutes of getting this person back down to a place where they were just comfortable and could be spoken with. And afterwards, this ring of law enforcement people were just amazed. And they asked her, "Are you a therapist? Is there a way we can do this? Is it a hypnosis technique?" And her response was, "Just try being nice to people."
Kevin Baltic. Kevin, thank you. God. And I bet you there's so many people in the room who have stories like that they could share. In fact, we have a stories symposia event Saturday night. You can share your stories. So open discussion. Who has some questions or something they'd like to share? Some questions. Miss. Stand up, please.
Hi there. It's Oriana.
Hey.
Quick question. I think Natalie was getting to it, but something that I'm thinking about is, so on one end, we want to know, why are there no African Americans, volunteering for these trials, right? But something that I want to sort of touch on is, okay, let's say that we somehow get this community and this population to become part of our movement, right? If the communities are already marginalized, right? How are they going to be able to get this kind of treatment? I mean, not even if it was free, right? I mean, it's a matter of education and resource. I mean, how do we even, I don't know, I can't imagine how this very niche, awesome therapeutic treatment is going to be something that everyone can access, right? I can't imagine that. So what are the thoughts that, MAPS has on that for the future?
Yeah, well, the first thing is we should all look around and look how white this room is. And, I did think that loads of people of color, particularly veterans, would volunteer for our study. So I think we have to be more proactive and reach out, as in a lot of the ways that Natalie was saying. And I think we have to suggest to people that we are able to sensitively work with them, that their trauma goes way deep, and that we need special outreach. We now, I went to one of the whitest places. I was up on top of a mountain. There's a group called Summit that has discussions, and so they have a mountain out in Utah. So I was giving a talk at the top of this mountain in the middle of a whiteout with snow all around, and there was this African-American female psychiatrist, Stephanie Stewart, who was interested in this area, and so now we've encouraged her. She's gone through our training. So we're going to try to have more bridges, active bridges between marginalized communities and what we're doing. And the FDA basically wants your phase 3 studies to look like America. They want it to be racially diverse, gender balanced, and so we're going to have to make a special effort to figure that out.
I was just going to also add that I would be really interested down the line in seeing how group work might be effective in a population like that is traumatized by kind of more of a group trauma. I think that could be a really interesting mode of doing that work. And I know kind of one of the questions that was going to get cut off that was also similar to what you're asking is about the accessibility of MDMA therapy in general.
Well, we're going to have about 10 phase 3 sites, and this is our plan for the U.S. study. And one of them we're trying to negotiate right now with Kaiser in California and Oakland. And one of the reasons there is that I realized that MDMA therapy or psilocybin therapy, it's very labor intensive. And so it's initially more expensive than just giving somebody a pharmacological pill every day. But over time, the pills don't work as well and they add up as well. But how are we going to get insurance companies to cover it? And so if we can add to our protocols and we're now designing these instruments that are going to look at healthcare utilization expenses, because people with PTSD utilize healthcare more frequently than people without PTSD. They have anxiety, they have all sorts of somatic symptoms from the stress and the tension. So we're going to be hopefully aligning ourselves with Kaiser, and they're going to have tracked the people's healthcare utilization with PTSD before they get into the study and then after. So I think it's our challenge is to try to figure out how to make alliances with insurance companies. And also, just in terms of access, I met yesterday with Lori Sutton, who's a retired brigadier general, who's the highest ranking psychiatrist in the U.S. Army, and she's head of veterans, the commissioner of Veterans Affairs for the city of New York. And we were talking about the latest statistics that just came out that we received from the VA. As of June 30th of this year, 868,000 veterans are receiving disability payments for PTSD. There's another 600,000 for other major mental illnesses like depression and anxiety. And just for PTSD, it costs in the neighborhood of $15 billion a year. And when we think about the cost of war, these are mostly young people, and this is going to be on for decades to come. So there's a financial incentive for the Department of Defense and the VA as well. We haven't yet persuaded them that responsibility should extend to funding MDMA research. But I think that we will see the opportunity to get insurance companies involved, and it will be accessible. And hopefully we will develop a broader base of people that are comfortable coming. But I think that is one of our major challenges, is we have to proactively do that.
And actually, to add to hopefully facilitating that, Ismail Ali, who has just started working with me in the policy team on MAPS, is interested in developing a group called POC, Psychonauts of Color. So we're hopeful. There actually has been a kind of amazing network developed over the last few years of psychedelic societies around the world and around the U.S. Right now, our list is over 80 societies. Wow. From Pakistan to Czech Republic, to all over the U.S., to the South even. So I think these groups are really important in helping changing culture in their communities. So I'm hopeful that with a group like Psychonauts of Color, that could also help cultivate a safer space for people of color to talk about psychedelics, maybe learn about MAPS' research, and go from there.
We have another question from the audience. Miss, stand up, please.
I just wanted to say something just occurred to me. I was going to talk on a different topic, but I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner, so a lot of these issues are coming into my everyday practice right now. Actually, I work with old people. But as a follow-up to what you're saying, I think a very powerful movement right now in psychiatry is peer-to-peer. And I think that's how you're going to make your breakthroughs. That's becoming beyond self-help. And we've seen an example actually with radical extremism. There's a project being supported by Google and by Ed Ventures, which is a venture capital fund right now, only interested in education. Peer-to-peer, I think, is where it's at. So it goes beyond self-help. So if we can find certain people in the community who have gone through these types of therapies, PTSD is really awful. You know, in follow-up to what Rick has just said, within the VA, it takes almost 10 different types of treatment services per VA veteran to cope with PTSD, and it doesn't work.
You make a very good point, because MDMA, of all the psychedelics, is the most inherently therapeutic on its own. And we get a lot of people come to us and say, I took MDMA at a rave, or I took it at Burning Man, and I healed myself from different issues. And so one of the things that we're doing, because we're, again, nonprofit drug development, the treatment manual that describes our therapeutic method, it's posted for free on the website. And the trainings that we do at Burning Man and elsewhere involve hundreds of people that we're training. This year there was over 200 volunteers. And they're able, within a few hours, both, kind of what Kevin said, just to be nice to people, but also to learn about a little bit about how to work with psychedelics with people. That a lot of people, who aren't formally psychotherapists are able to be profoundly helpful to people having a difficult trip. And so I think the peer-to-peer approach really has a lot of merit. And it's also, one of the things that we know from psychotherapy outcome research is that the key factor is the therapeutic alliance. It's the trust between the therapist and the patient. It's not the school of therapy that they practice that matters, but it's really that trust. And when you have a situation with friends that you trust, a lot of times people can open up in certain ways. And that is a way to provide it at virtually no cost and to help a large number of people. But if we have these clinic settings and trained therapists for people that isn't enough, then I think we'll be able to cover way more people.
And I'll say that group work is also a form of peer counseling, and that's really effective in both psychedelic settings and even integration after. So I think it would be really interesting to see, even with individual psychedelic therapy, how we might be able to use group work and peer work to help integrate after and continue supporting.
Yeah, we're making some steps towards that group work too, so that our first study in collaboration with VA-affiliated therapists, but we're funding it, it's taking place outside of the VA, is a therapy that was developed, a non-drug therapy called cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy, conjoint meaning couples. And so it's couples therapy where one member of the couple has PTSD and it affects the relationship. And we were able to get permission from the FDA, from the DEA, from the IRB to give both members of the couple MDMA, not just the person with PTSD. And we've run the first couple already. So that's the first time since Rick Strassman got approval for DMT research in 1990 that more than one person has been able to be dosed at the same time. And there's a team at Johns Hopkins that's talking about trying to do a project with a group with MDMA, not patients, but at least initially with healthy volunteers, and see what happens when you do physiological measurements and other safety measures to administer MDMA to a group of people at one time. And we know, of course, that the ayahuasca circles and the peyote Native American Church, all of those are group settings.
Rick Doblin and Natalie Ginsburg, thank you very, very much. Thank you for joining us. Yes.
You did great.
Amazing.
That went so fast.